One may look at the Hundred Years' War and believe that it's a simple war that lasted 118 years between the English and the French. However, this war is anything but simple, and anything but 100 years of war. Today we start a three-part series looking at the beginning, middle, and end of the greatest fight between French and English troops until 1756, that is. Let's start before the beginning, at what caused the first phase of the war. Louis X of France was dead in 1316, leaving a daughter, Joan II of Navarre, and a son, John I of France. However, he would only die at the age of 4 days old. Joan II's paternity was in limbo, as her mother, Margaret of Burgundy, was accused of adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair. With all the turmoil, Philip, Count of Poitiers, and brother to the late Louis X, was taken as king, further solidifying the French royal custom at the time of no female monarchs. He would later become Philip V until 1322, when he died, leaving only 2 daughters. The crown passed to his younger brother, who became Charles IV. When Charles IV died in 1328, he left a young daughter and a pregnant wife, and decreed that if the baby was a boy, he would be king, else the king was to be chosen by the nobles. It may come as no surprise at all, but the baby was in fact a girl, Blanche of France, later the Duchess of Orleans. This would ultimately end the House of Capet. By blood, the nearest heir was Henry III of England, son of Isabella of France, who was the sister of Charles IV. But then the question arose: could she transmit the right to inherit the throne of France? The French nobles resented the idea of being ruled by an Englishman, especially one whose mother is suspected of murdering Edward II. The French barons, prelates, and University of Paris agreed that males who derive their right to inherit through their mothers should not be considered for the throne of France, including Edward III. This left Philip, Count of Valois, Charles IV's first cousin. He would be crowned Philip VI in 1328, and in 1340, the Avignon papacy confirmed under Salic law that males couldn't inherit the throne from their mothers. Moving away from the French royal customs, we can take a further look to when Anglo-French tensions began in 1066, as when William, Duke of Normandy, was crowned England's king, the whole realm became a French protectorate. Since, however, England now owned the Duchy of Normandy, this allowed them to influence the mainland affairs. To French kings, this would threaten their authority, and so they seek to undermine English influence, while the English would seek to expand it. In the 11th century, Gascony, in the southwest of France, was fully incorporated into Aquitaine, commonly known as Guyenne, making the province of Guyenne and Gascony. The Angevin kings of England now became the Dukes of Aquitaine after Henry II married the former Queen of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, in 1152. Once Edward III's reign began, only Gascony remained in his hands. For 10 years, it had been a point of contention for Edward. The English argued that because Charles IV hadn't acted properly towards it, then England should have Aquitaine with no French suzerainty. The French rejected this, and so in 1329, Edward III paid homage to Philip VI. The tradition was for vassals to approach unarmed and hands bare, but Edward would do no such thing, arriving with his crown atop his head and sword around his waist. The final nail in the coffin before the Hundred Years' War was the Old Alliance between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Scotland. This alliance was signed in 1295, during the reign of Philip the Fair, with Charles IV renewing it in 1326. This meant that if one was to be invaded by England specifically, then the other would join to their aid. As part of a crusade to the Levant, Philip VI had a large fleet anchored at Marseille, but this was moved, along with a detachment from the Scottish Navy, to Normandy in 1336 to threaten England. The English response was quite civil, as they raised two armies, one to fight the Scots, quote, at a suitable time, and the other to be stationed in Gascony. Simultaneously, emissaries of the King of England would be sent to the French court to propose a treaty. Philip was invited to a meeting with the English delegation in April 1337, but had refused. Instead, he signalled the Arrêt Ban, a call to arms. In May, Philip met with his council in Paris, and it was decided that Philip should take Gascony as Edward III was in breach of his vassal obligations by sheltering Robert d'Artois. Edward countered by challenging Philip's claim to the French throne. Edward reminded everyone that his claim to the throne was through his mother, and it was renewed that this claim was false by Salic law, but in 1340 Edward took up the title of King of France and the French royal arms. Edward would receive support from Guy, half-brother to the court of Flanders. He would aim to strengthen his alliances with the Low Countries, then they could claim that they were loyal to the true King of France, and thus were not rebelling against Philip. June 22nd, 1340, Edward and his fleet would sail from England to arrive off the Swin estuary the following day. The French had taken defensive positions outside the port of Sluis. England would feign a retreat, only to return when the sun and wind were behind them, nearly annihilating the French fleet at the Battle of Sluis. This marked English dominance of the seas, keeping the homeland safe. If not for the death of the Duke of Brittany, Edward would have to sue for peace due to lack of funds. But the death of the Duke sparked a succession crisis between John of Montfort, half-brother to the old Duke, and Charles of Blois, nephew to Philip VI. This dispute would ignite the War of Breton Succession in 1341, and Edward would support John Montfort. The next few years would focus on this civil war, with the city of Vannes changing hands multiple times, while campaigns in Gascony saw mixed results. In July of 1346, Edward would launch an invasion across the Channel, landing on the Normandy coast, capturing the city of Caen and surprising the French. While Philip massed an army, Edward moved north to the Low Countries, pillaging as he went, before reaching the Seine, only to find that most of the crossings were destroyed. He would march in Paris's direction before crossing at Poissy and continuing to Flanders until he reached the Somme. They would cross at a tidal ford at Blanchetaque and stranding Philip's army. The two would try to outmaneuver each other until eventually they turned to face each other. Courtesy of English longbowmen, the Battle of Crécy, 1346, was a complete disaster for the French. It didn't aid the French that their king forced them to attack before they were organised. Philip would appeal to David II of Scotland for aid, who responded by invading northern England, but this advance was stopped at the Battle of Neville's Cross on October 17th, with David II being captured. Edward would march upon and besiege Calais, capturing it the following year. This allowed England easy access into northern France throughout and beyond the conflict. 1348, and the Black Death had arrived in Paris. It wouldn't be until 1355 when England could finally recover financially. King Edward's son, known as the Black Prince, led a chevauchée from Gascony into France proper, pillaging Avignon, Castelnaudary, Carcassonne, and Narbonne. He would again conduct a chevauchée the next year, ravaging Auvergne, Limousin, and Berry. The Black Prince would send terms of surrender to John II, but he refused, having outflanked the English near Poitiers. The subsequent battle routed the French and led to the capture of John II. During the chaos of his son's regency, a report recounted, "All went ill with the kingdom and the state was undone. Thieves and robbers rose up everywhere in the land. The nobles despised and hated all others and took no thought for usefulness and profit of lord and men. They subjected and despoiled the peasants and the men of the villages. In no wise did they defend their country from its enemies. Rather did they trample it underfoot, robbing and pillaging the peasants' goods." From the Chronicles of Jean de Venay. For the third and final time, Edward invaded France, capitalizing on the chaos and wishing to seize the throne once and for all. Dauphin, John II's son, led a strategy of Fabian retreat against Edward. But Edward wasn't interested in fighting. He wanted the crown and would choose Rheims as his coronation site. The locals would defend the city, leading Edward to besiege it for 5 weeks, with no weakening in the defences, leading to no coronation. Edward would then move to Paris, but would retreat after reaching the suburbs, and then made for Chartres. Disaster hit as a hailstorm hit their camp, killing 1,000 Englishmen, earning the day Black Monday in Easter 1360. This forced Edward to the negotiation table, resulting in the Treaty of Brittany in May of 1360. Edward would gain lands in Aquitaine but would lose titles to land in Normandy, Touraine, Anjou and Maine, and would reduce John's ransom by 1 million crowns. Edward would also abandon his claim to the French throne. John II would be held for 4 years, with a ransom set at 3 million crowns, and allowed hostages to be held in lieu of John, as dictated in the treaty. The hostages included his 2 sons, several princes and nobles, 4 inhabitants of Paris, and 2 citizens from each of the 19 principal towns in France. As these hostages were carted off, John would return to France to raise money for the ransom. However, in 1362, John's son, Louis of Anjou, a hostage in Calais, escaped. This led John to return to England, bound by his honour. In 1363, the Navarres used John II's capture to try and seize power from the weakness of the Dauphin. While nothing official was made, Edward III silently supported the moves of Navarre. In 1364, John II would die in London, still honouring his captivity. Charles V would ascend to the throne of France, and 3 days before his coronation, the Navarres lost at the Battle of Courchevel.